By his nature, Satan is a divisive character. His very reason for being is to create division amongst humanity and lead as many people off the righteous path and away from the benevolence of God. Yet he is also divisive in the sense that there exist several traditions and narratives that paint him in various different shades, from evil tempter to fallen angel to divine adversary or divine persecutor. Satan therefore wears many faces, some of which are not congruent with other faiths and doctrines, but nonetheless have come to shape who or what the devil is to believers and non-believers alike. Indeed, if we look at the interpretations of traditional Catholic belief, we see Satan was once an angel who rebelled against God, and now leads other fallen angels in an ongoing war against humanity. Yet other Christian interpretations see Satan as the serpent in the Garden of Eden, who tempted Adam and Eve into sin, much as he is later seen as a tempter in the New Testament, where he confronts Jesus in the desert and Judas at the Last Supper. Some Protestant denominations, by contrast, view Satan as more metaphorical in nature, as opposed to an actual entity that coincides with our own existence. So many things in this episode will probably resonate with or contradict one's understanding of who or what Satan is. This is simply the nature of theology in this context. No view is right or wrong. It's simply a matter of belief. This then speaks to how complex and multifaceted the character and role of Satan is throughout Christian and ancient Jewish belief. That one moment, Satan is merely a title used to describe an adversary, but by the next moment, he is actualized into a living, breathing devil that represents all evil and hates mankind. The word Satan appears at least 49 times across the Old and New Testaments, according to the King James Version. And if you were to read this as it is printed, you'd probably have no qualms about imagining this Satan as the big bad devil. However, in the original Hebrew, such a concept was not yet thought of. There was no supreme wicked entity that lurked in the dark confines of the world, seeking to undo everything that God had put into place. To be blunt, there was no Satan, at least not in the way we understand him today. In some interpretations, the word Satan, or Satan, is not to be taken as a proper noun or a name, but rather as a title or office. That which could be assigned not just to this personification of a principal evil, but to anyone who fit the criteria. Satan, or Satan then, was not believed to be the devil, but was instead in reference to other humans, usually those who were either accusers, those believed to deliver judgments or consequences, or adversaries, obstacles, hindrances, anyone who served as opposition. For example, in Psalm 109, we see David plead for God not to remain silent while his enemies attack him with lies, and in his anguish, he unleashes a vivid series of curses on the one who wronged him. He remarks, "Set thou a wicked man over him, and let Satan stand at his right hand." Now, to the regular reader, it might be interpreted that David means for God to set the devil on the right side of this man, and for this man to be troubled by the wicked entity for his transgressions. However, the ancient Hebrew would have us believe that this is not the devil at all, but rather merely an accuser or an adversary. In essence, David is asking God for the man who has wronged him to be judged, not by a celestial supernatural entity, but simply by a corporeal one, who is qualified to do so. A similar instance occurs concerning David much earlier in 1 Samuel 29, the moment when David, who had been living among the Philistines to escape Saul, was nearly forced to fight against his own people. As the Philistine armies gathered for battle, their commanders grew suspicious of David and feared he might turn on them in the middle of the fight to regain Saul's favor. If we consult the Orthodox Jewish Bible, we see the term Satan used again. "Send the Ish back, that he may turn again to his home, which thou hast assigned him, and let him not go down with us to Milcomah, lest in the Milcomah he be as Satan to us." Here, David himself is appointed as the Satan, because it is feared that he will become something of an obstacle or adversary to the Philistines the moment he gets his chance. In both of these examples, the Satan in question is referring not to a devilish entity, but rather just a human one, who would adopt the role as either accuser or adversary respectfully. In the original Hebrew script, however, we also see the term ha-Satan, which, unlike the singular Satan, was believed in some interpretations to not be a human adversary or accuser, but in fact the title of a divine being that served as a prosecutor in the employment of God. In English, it would simply read as the Satan or the Satan. So yes, what seems to have started as a name or office for one who accuses or serves adversarially somehow evolved into a more divine occupation, reserved for an entity who, in the case of the book of Job, was something of a prosecutor in God's heavenly court. Here in this narrative, God presides over his heavenly court, where he is met by his angels, believed to be the sons of God, and the Satan, the adversary. Now, to the average reader, they would be forgiven to have read this as simply Satan the devil, which some interpretations do corroborate. After all, the entity does reveal that he's been going back and forth on the earth, and does seem to surprise God that he's actually here in the heavenly court, allowing some to consolidate the account that this was the same Satan who was cast down to the earth and effectively bound there. But if we were to go with the earlier idea that this was not the Satan who had fallen from heaven and sworn vengeance upon mankind, and instead this adversary or prosecutor, then Satan's role becomes a little less evil and a little more practical. This Satan serves his role in God's court not to maliciously harm Job, but instead to find Job guilty of only worshipping God as a result of the perceived nepotism shown to him. In Zechariah, meanwhile, we see Joshua standing before both an angel of the Lord and ha-Satan, the former who served Joshua as something akin to a defense attorney, and the latter of whom accuses Joshua of essentially not being worthy enough to fulfill his role as high priest of the Jews. Ha-Satan's accusation here is kind of like quality control on behalf of God. He is not accusing Joshua simply to vilify him, but rather bring to light and to the attention of God that a ragtag group, those being exiles from Babylon, who were described as filthily dressed, were probably not the best candidates to pick to build the new temple and establish a new priesthood. Yet God is seen to rebuke the Satan here, showcasing that whilst this entity believed he knew best, his wisdom and foresight was not on the level of God's, who did not judge Joshua's clothes nor his countenance, but rather simply knew that Joshua was the correct and only choice. Through this narrative, we can see that the difference between the Satan's understanding and God's understanding is chasm-like, and proves to reveal the hierarchical structure of God's heavenly court, with God obviously being the most high and the Satan and associated entities situated beneath him. Finally, in 1 Chronicles 21, we see Satan mentioned again, but this one is a little tricky to dissect. I've seen arguments for and against, referring to this as either Satan the devil or ha-Satan the accuser and celestial prosecutor, so it really boils down to personal preference here. On the one hand, Satan appears to be inciting David to take a census of Israel, an act he knows will displease God and thus incur punishment for, or he seeks to prove to God that David is a sinner as the Satan, thus providing evidence as is typical with any accusation in a traditional courtroom. Another idea is that after David orders the census and subsequently realizes his sin, Satan, or the Satan, is not seen to be working for God, for he is not acknowledged by him, but seems to act independently by tempting David into taking his advice he knows was detrimental to the trust of God. By this then, Satan, or the Satan, might be seen as the embodiment of certain chaos, seeking to undo mankind with his wicked suggestions and ruin them by ensuring they incur the wrath of the Almighty. Yet it might also be said that this is again another example of what you might call quality control. Ha-Satan is rooting out the weakness of David, so he reveals to God the level of David's devotion and commitment to him, which in this example, David certainly falls short on. In that sense, Ha-Satan, though perhaps reveling in man's folly, actually helps God better understand his subjects and illuminates their shortcomings, allowing them to learn atonement and providing an opportunity to rectify certain behaviours. You might say here that with the exception of the account in 1 Chronicles 21, where Satan comes across like a tempter, encouraging David to surrender to his human insecurities and second-guess the work of God, neither Job or Zechariah's account sound much like Satan the fallen angel, or Satan the antagonist of God. For one, he seems to be working for God. He's serving God by scrutinizing both Job and Joshua to the point that if there was anything dubious about them, it would have been revealed. Furthermore, we don't see the Satan invoke the third of the angels that would have fallen with him from heaven. We don't see him deceive Job or Joshua the way he was believed to do so toward Adam and Eve in the guise of the serpent, according to some interpretations, nor do we see him act with any particular wickedness. Yet in modern belief, we see this term Satan and are quick to equate it to the devil, to the wicked tempter and all-round agent of chaos that wants nothing more but to bring about the downfall of humanity. Indeed, some Christian attitudes towards this account in Job, Zechariah and Chronicles can quite easily justify these as being acts of the devil, not an accuser or adversary. In these ideas, Satan's mischievous ways see him insult Joshua's integrity by commenting on his clothes, perhaps urging Joshua to seek his advice and convey himself in a more presentable manner, a ploy that might have worked against Joshua if he had actually listened. In Job, he relishes in bringing harm and even gets to kill members of Job's family, albeit indirectly, which most certainly would have aligned with his desire to see humankind suffer. In Chronicles, he baits David into a trap, knowing full well he will be punished for it, and probably takes great satisfaction in seeing the carnage that God proceeds to unload on him. Many believers today might resonate with these ideas, and might not have considered there to have been any other culprit in these narratives than the devil himself, especially if they'd never consulted the original Hebrew. So then the question must be asked, how and when did this Ha-Satan character, who served as God's harsh but truthful prosecutor, evolve into the malignant and dastardly reprobate that we all recognize today as the ultimate personification of evil? One prevalent idea amongst scholars is that when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC, they took many of the scribes, priests, and devout figures back to their kingdom, where they remained for nearly 50 years. Now, 50 years might not have been enough time for the Israelite captives to have completely rewritten their narratives with Babylonian influence, but some might argue that the beliefs of their captors did indeed spread into the pages of the Old Testament, with creatures like the Lilitu, later being equated with Lilith, emerging in the likes of the Book of Isaiah. Other dark entities of such a nature, including the likes of the Babylonian Hanbi, a lord of evil, was believed to be associated with and perhaps inspiring Lucifer in Christian thought, and thus may have been the basis of moving Ha-Satan from strict yet neutral prosecutor to evil capricious devil. Of course, much of this is conjecture. A more discussed idea amongst scholars is that after these near 50 years of captivity, the Israelites were freed from their bonds by the invading Achaemenid Persian Empire, who defeated the Babylonians and allowed the captives to return to Judea. In his work, The Devil, Perceptions of Evil, From Antiquity to Primitive Christianity, author Jeffrey Russell expresses that before this exile to Babylon, there were no concepts of a rebellious angel, no war in heaven, no specific enemy of God working to undermine him and ruin his creations. Yet 2 centuries after returning to Judea, where the Jews were now likely under the influence and control of the Persians who liberated them, The idea of their almighty, omnipotent God having a direct opposite, a darker counterpart, an adversary, if you will, began to gain traction. Something must have happened to the Jewish narrative, whether it be the direct influence of the Babylonian or Persian authorities that turned a lowercase Satan into an uppercase Satan. As aforementioned, despite being liberated, Judea remained a part of the Achaemenid Persian Empire until as late as 332 BC, where Alexander the Great conquered the land, introducing the region to the Hellenistic world and ushering in a Greek influence that was otherwise unheard of. So not only were the ancient Jews exposed to the dark entities in Babylonian legend, as well as the Persian ideas surrounding Zoroastrianism, but they were also introduced to the colourful world of the Greek gods and their associated stories. With that in mind, you might say it would be miraculous if the ancient Jewish authors weren't tempted at all to incorporate some of these ideas into their own writings, and it isn't out of the realm of possibility that the Satan graduated into something far more diabolical. Many scholars suggest that Zoroastrianism was the biggest player when it came to transforming the original Jewish narratives. Not only was the religion of the Jews similar to Zoroastrianism in their monotheistic nature, but the Zoroastrian deity known as Ahura Mazda was also believed to be the supreme divinity, the most benevolent, and the all-powerful. Comparisons were surely drawn between this Ahura Mazda and Yahweh by the religious folk on both sides. In his work, Zoroastrianism, An Introduction to Ancient Faith, author Peter Clark tells us, there are so many features that Zoroastrianism seems to share with the Judeo-Christian tradition that it would be difficult to deny some relationship between them. One of the glaring differences between Yahweh and Ahura Mazda, however, was that the latter had his very own nemesis, an evil being known as Angra Mainyu, sometimes Ahriman. With this in mind, some scholars suggest that the ancient Jews adopted the idea of Angra Mainyu and developed Har-Satan into a similar malevolent entity with all of his abhorrent qualities to serve no longer as a persecutor of God, but as a dualistic opposition to him. One of the issues with this idea is that tracing Zoroastrian influence on post-exilic Judaism isn't exactly straightforward. Scholars who are equally at home in both Jewish apocalyptic literature and Zoroastrian texts aren't exactly in abundance. In fact, even if you were to go back in time to this period of 300 BC, any collaborative narrative concerning Judean Zoroastrian influence would have been relatively novel. That is to say, even back then, the ideas that influenced Judaism weren't necessarily canon at that stage. Indeed, this influence, whether from Zoroastrianism, Babylon, or even the Greeks, would take a number of years to become fully integrated into the Old Testament text, by which point no one would have remembered how exactly it came about, much less who incorporated it. One of the more obvious Zoroastrian influences can be seen in the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient Jewish manuscripts written in Hebrew that are believed to have been authored around this time period of 300 BC. This manuscript preserved a number of biblical texts and narratives that were believed at that time, including one text known as the Community Rule that details God creating not only spirits of light, but also spirits of darkness, perhaps most prominently the Angel of Darkness. It reads, "The angel of darkness leads all the children of righteousness astray. All their sins, iniquities, wickedness, and all their unlawful deeds are caused by his dominion." This is the first time we get a glimpse of a supernatural entity that is not only directly responsible for sin, but also inherently wicked, an antithesis of what the Almighty had come to represent. Before this, you could argue that man was responsible for sin, and that all the bad things that happened in the Old Testament were because of man's own folly. Now, with the introduction of this wicked angel, there was someone actively trying to warp and corrupt humanity, a being who seemingly operated outside of God's jurisdiction and could tempt manipulate, and deceive any one of us. Unlike Ha-Satan, this entity is evidently not an accuser or an adversary working on behalf of God, but instead a selfish being with his own insidious agenda. If we continue with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we later see this entity established as Belial, an evil angel who leads other evil angels in an eternal war against God and humanity. Now, doesn't this sound like someone we know? If we progress deeper into the Dead Sea Scrolls, we come across the War Scroll, which details a final battle between the Sons of Darkness, led by Belial, and the Sons of Light, led by the Archangel Michael. Readers of the Book of Revelation will know that this sounds almost identical to the heavenly conflict between Michael and Lucifer, with Lucifer's angels attempting to overthrow God, but ultimately being stumped and defeated by the forces of Michael. Whilst on the topic of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we also find Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch, where the text begins to see the outline of a distinctly evil angelic figure taking shape. This text is essentially an elaborate expansion of the brief episode in Genesis 6, where the sons of God take human women and sire the monstrous Nephilim. In Enoch's retelling, these wayward angels become corruptors of mankind, teaching forbidden arts, magic, astrology, warfare, and anything else that is deemed destructive. Yet the villain at the center of this drama isn't Satan, nor is it Belial. Instead, Enoch names several candidates, the most prominent in the Book of Watchers being Semyaza or Azazel, the former being the leader of this angelic cohort, and the latter being the one who transgresses so terribly by teaching mankind how to fight that he ends up shouldering much of the blame for the entire episode. While Satan, nor the term Satan, shows up in the first book of Enoch, we do see it mentioned 4 times in the second book of Enoch. In chapter 40, Enoch hears the voices of 4 angels speaking before the Lord. It is the 4th voice that proves to be the most interesting, for we are told, "And I heard the 4th voice fending off the Satans, and forbidding them to come before the Lord of Spirits, to accuse them who dwell on the earth." Later in chapter 53, we see the singular use of Satan, capitalized and seemingly intended as a noun, with Enoch witnessing the angels of punishment preparing iron chains to bind the instruments of Satan, all those who, as explained by the angel Phanuel in chapter 54, were those who were led astray by Satan on the earth. It should be noted that as 1 Enoch was written around 300 BC, it makes sense that Satan doesn't specifically appear, because again, this idea of an evil celestial entity was still relatively new. Yet by 2 Enoch, written around 70 BC, Satan isn't introduced, but rather casually mentioned, as if the reader ought to have known who he was and why the likes of the punishing angels would be preparing iron chains for his followers. If we look to another text found within the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Jubilees, we see another expansion on the Book of Genesis that provides us with more apocalyptic themes and ideas. Here, Jubilees introduces Mastema, who in the post-Diluvian landscape begins to gain a foothold in the New World by leading Noah's sons astray. The text tells us that Noah becomes suspicious of his son's behavior and comes to realize that unclean demons were on the earth in those days and were actively trying to corrupt his sons, inciting them to commit transgressions against themselves and each other. Noah pleads with God to help him, and so God commands his angels to bind all the demons. Yet it is here that the entity Mastema makes himself known and is able to bargain with God that if he is allowed to keep just 1/10 of the demons on earth, he would use them to befoul or torment humanity, because, to be blunt, they kind of deserved it. This seemed to resonate with God, who must have agreed with such sentiment, because he does exactly that which Mastema suggested, sending 9 parts of the demons into the place of condemnation whilst allowing the 10th part to remain on the earth. While not in the canonical Bible, Mastema embodies the developing concept of a singular evil figure, analogous to the later Christian version of Satan, but still within a framework where he serves God's purposes. It's not too much of a stretch to say that Mastema was ultimately conflated into the entity we now widely recognize today. He who was a chief figure leading demons, who continued to act as both God's accuser and also moonlighted as a tempter to mankind, vilifying first Noah's sons and then the rest of humanity that followed. In the New Testament, Satan's role becomes much more delineated, and his character is firmly established as a tempter and a deceiver, as we see him try to tempt Jesus in the desert and later corrupt Judas at the Last Supper. But his portfolio expands when modern readers attempt to conflate the Old and New Testaments into one continuative account, where this Satan replaces Ha-Satan in the accounts of Zechariah, Chronicles, and Job. By this understanding, the singular evil entity that is now the devil becomes the one vilifying Joshua, tempting David into sin, plaguing Job with sores, and killing his family. With this rhetoric amongst readers, Ha-Satan is no longer a servant of God, but in fact the devil, Satan, who can now lure people into sin, inflict sickness, and even death. In its simplest form, you might say Ha-Satan received the buff of all buffs. He is also portrayed as the Archon, the ruler of the demonic host. Yet none of this originates in the Hebrew Old Testament itself. These traits come straight out of the same theological currents we've already discussed: the fallen angels of 1 Enoch, the malevolent Belial of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Mastema in the Book of Jubilees. If there's one thing this journey through scripture, tradition, and ancient imagination has shown us, it is that Satan was never a fixed monolithic figure. He shifts and reshapes himself depending on who was writing, when they were writing, and what anxieties or hopes their society demanded of them. In the earliest Hebrew texts, he is little more than a role, an accuser, a stumbling block, a figure who served God by exposing human frailty. In later Jewish writings, he begins to absorb the qualities of foreign mythologies, taking on a more sinister hue as a fallen angel, a corrupting spirit, and a cosmic adversary within the Jewish imagination. By the time we reach the New Testament, that gradual evolution has hardened into something far more familiar: a distinct tempter, a deceiver, an enemy of Christ and humanity alike. Yet none of these phases erases the one that came before. Instead, they accumulate, layer upon layer, until Satan becomes a composite of centuries worth of fears and cultural exchanges. Whether he is Ha-Satan, God's prosecuting attorney, the chaotic whisperer behind David's census, the corrupter of Noah's sons, or the leader of rebel angels in apocalyptic visions, each version solidified Satan as a mainstay figure and perhaps ultimately shaped him into God's conceptual counterpart. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.